The top 10 best senators. There have been 1,314 members of the U.S. Senate over the course of U.S. history, with several members standing out above the rest. The Senate plays a key role in passing legislation, and as such, some senators become just as influential as the president in ensuring that policies are passed through, and since there are no term limits, a senator can maintain influence over multiple decades. This list rates the top 10 greatest senators based on the length of service, their impact in American politics, and leadership in getting legislation passed through or heading the various committees of the Senate. Number 10, J. Lester Hill. Joseph Lester Hill represented Alabama for over 45 years and constantly fought to ensure good funding for education, hospitals, and internal improvements for rural areas. Hill had been the president of the Montgomery School Board before being elected to the House in 1923 and maintained his commitment to public education. He likewise fought for reforming mental institutions to make them more humane and reformative. He sponsored several bills to meet his agenda, such as the Hill-Burton Act in 1946, Hill-Harris Act of 1964, Library Service Act, and Rural Housing and Telephone Act, Vocational Education Act, and National Defense Education Act of 1958. He consistently pushed for aid for rural communities, ensuring they'd get high-quality libraries, schools, and hospitals. While he was generally in line with other Southern Democrats, Hill would break away from his colleagues on other issues like favoring federal control over offshore drilling to use the money for education. Despite his opposition to civil rights and the ruling of Brown v. Board of Education, Hill's policies would benefit all poor citizens of Alabama, both black and white. He consistently fought for the betterment of rural communities and promoting high-quality hospital care and education, making him one of the best Alabama statesmen. Number 9, Nelson Aldrich. The maternal grandfather and namesake of Vice President Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, despite being a senator from the smallest state in the Union, Aldrich comprised one of the big four Republicans of the Gilded Age, which controlled much of the Senate's policies during their 30-year tenure. He became known as the general manager of the country for his position on the Senate Finance Committee and influence over economic policies. Aldrich was a Civil War veteran and one-term representative before being elected to the Senate. Aldrich favored high tariffs to protect American industries, sponsoring the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act. Aldrich was also key in completely overhauling the country's economic system by establishing the National Monetary Commission via the Aldrich-Vreeland Act to study the causes of the Panic of 1907, and was the chair of the Aldrich Plan, which influenced the Federal Reserve System and sponsored the 16th Amendment, allowing for a direct federal income tax, despite opposing it a decade earlier. The senator from the smallest state helped shape America's economic system to embrace the efficiency model of the Gilded and Progressive Age and ushered the U.S. into being an economic global power. Number 8, Russel B. Long. Son of the infamous Louisiana Governor Huey Long, Russel Long represented Louisiana for 40 years and in that time served as both chair of the Senate Finance Committee and the Senate Majority Whip. Long held the same views as his father, but was much more pragmatic about issues than him. Long was the leading voice for the poor, disabled, elderly, plighted, and working class, and maintained a firm balance between providing social aid and welfare for the people, while also supporting tax reductions for the poor, middle class, small businesses, and disadvantaged. No one in the Senate had as comprehensive knowledge on tax code and laws than Long, and no other politician knew how to manage it more effectively. As the chair for the Senate Finance Committee, which he occupied for much of his career, he played a major role in advancing the Great Society and War on Poverty legislation, including the creation of Social Security benefits, Medicare, Medicaid, child support enforcement, employee stock ownership plans, and earned income tax credit, as well as breaking from other Southern Democrats in supporting the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, and in 1960 became the first Southern senator of the 20th century to hire black staff members. Despite his liberal record on government aid, Long understood the importance of big business, free enterprise, and was a staunch defender of oil and gas industries of Louisiana. Long was so influential in the Senate, he was voted the most effective chairman and debater by his colleagues in a U.S. News and World Report survey in 1980 and in 1982 as the most influential Democrat in the Senate, and was even dubbed the fourth branch of government by the Wall Street Journal. Long remained consistently popular with the people of Louisiana, and despite voting against most civil rights legislation, remained popular with black Louisianians consistently winning 90% of the black vote. When Long retired in 1987, despite remaining extremely popular, he was shown support from all members of Congress and all classes. Fellow Louisiana Senator Bennett Johnson said his absence will leave a huge void that is going to be very, very difficult to fill in Washington, and President Reagan described him as a legend and one of the most skilled legislators, compromisers, and legislative strategists in history. Number 7, William B. Allison. The second member of the Big Four on this list, another Civil War veteran, Allison was a centrist from Iowa whose flexibility allowed him to offer a variety of solutions for various problems while not holding the country back due to ideology. In 1878, Allison was able to compromise on the Bland-Allison Act to restore bimetallism to cause inflation as a means of easing the recession, and played a major role in passing the McKinley Tariff and Dingley Tariff Acts to raise tariffs as a means of protecting American industries. Allison would hold several positions in the Senate, including the chair of Senate Appropriations Committee, which he served longer than anyone else, and was a member of the Committee of Indian Affairs, Senate Finance and Gross Bills, and chairman of the Senate Republican Conference in 1897, which he held until his death in 1908. Allison had consistently been offered powerful cabinet positions by 4 Republican presidents, but declined them to retain his power in the Senate. His pragmatic approach to issues made him easy to work with from across the aisle, and consistently worked to compromise on bills to ensure their passage. Allison was said to have a knowledge of the Senate better than no one else, and became known as a great compromiser. Number 6, John Sherman. The 3-year junior brother of famed Union General William T. Sherman, served a variety of Senate and cabinet positions over his 4 decades in politics, holding nearly every major position in government except for president. During his first term in the Senate during the Civil War and Reconstruction, he was a major player in managing the country's finances and later economic policies. He would also play an important role in passing various bills to help the country's financial situation, such as the Contraction Act, Public Credit Act, and Funding Act. His second stint in the Senate after serving as Secretary of the Treasury would focus on fighting against corruption and supporting the passage of the Pendleton Service Act, which effectively ended the spoils system, replacing it with a merit-based system and eliminating corruption in D.C. Sherman was appointed to be the chairman for foreign relations and promoted opening relations with China and opposed the Chinese Exclusion Act. He also supported alien contract labor law, which gave protection to Chinese immigrants from exploitative contracts. Sherman supported regulations to railroads and eventually helped pass the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, which greatly lessened the influence of railroads while allowing competition. His most prominent piece of legislation was the Sherman Antitrust Act, which sought to regulate major monopolies that had begun to put a strangle on the country. Number 5, John Coit Spooner. Spooner, another Civil War veteran at the turn of the century, is the final member of the Big Four to make it onto this list, with his contributions coming in the form of America's foreign policy during the turn of the century. He became one of the primary architects for establishing a new government in the Philippines following the Spanish-American War, and authorized Theodore Roosevelt's purchase of the Panama Canal Zone via the Spooner Act. Spooner was a conservative who laid between his colleagues of Allison and Aldrich, understanding the importance of big business, but not being too lenient on monopolies, as shown by adding a provision to the Sherman Antitrust Act that went after Standard Oil. He was the head of the Committee on Canadian Relations from 1897 and Committee on Rules from 1899 until his resignation from the Senate in 1907. Spooner, in his decade in office, was a very popular figure in the GOP and was even offered several high-ranking cabinet positions, much like Allison. He was offered Secretary of the Interior and Attorney General by William McKinley on 2 different occasions, and then Secretary of State by William Howard Taft, but turned down these offers, believing he was more effective as a senator. Number 4, Oscar Underwood. A Wilsonian progressive from Alabama, Oscar Underwood served in the House of Representatives for 20 years before ascending to the Senate in 1915. Just as he supported Wilson's policies while as House Majority Leader, Underwood continued to aid Wilson's progressive agenda in matters of lowering tariffs and supporting labor rights. Underwood was also chosen by President Harding as a delegate to the Washington Naval Convention, where he negotiated the Five-Power Treaty to limit naval armament of the Entente powers following World War I in an attempt to avoid another naval arms race. He was also the first official Senate Minority Leader serving from 1920 to 1923. However, he did not always side with progressives. When calls for prohibition on alcohol became popular, Underwood stood against it, and even more shockingly took a stance against the Ku Klux Klan, attempting to denounce them and officially condemn them in the Democratic Convention of 1924, being one of the few anti-Klan politicians from the South. His attempts ultimately ended in vain, as the DNC would vote not to denounce the Klan, and Underwood would lose to future Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black, who himself was a former member of the Ku Klux Klan. Number 3. Robert A. Taft. The second son of President and Chief Justice William Howard Taft, Robert Taft was one of the most influential politicians of the 20th century. No other member of Congress knew the Constitution better than he did. Taft led the conservative coalition to oppose FDR's New Deal policies due to their inefficiencies, but also supported moderate policies like Social Security and public housing projects. Taft was an avowed isolationist and opposed entry into World War II. When the U.S. did get involved and Japanese Americans were forced into concentration camps, he began mass opposition, believing it was wrong to lock away innocent Americans. Along with his co-sponsoring of the Hill-Thomas Federal Aid Education Bill, Taft also co-sponsored the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, which brought an end to closed shops and banned numerous strikes as a means to restore order during the wave of massive union-led strikes following the war. Although he continued to oppose many of Harry S. Truman's domestic policies, he'd play a major role in passing the Housing Act of 1949, as well as support the Truman Doctrine, while insisting the U.S. not entangle itself in international organizations like NATO or the UN. Taft would also criticize Truman's handling for the Korean War. By the end of his career and life in 1953, he'd become Senate Majority Leader and was considered the most powerful man in Congress. Although he failed to become president in his 4 attempts throughout his career, Taft never backed down from what he believed was right. It is said the difference between a politician and statesman is a politician says anything to stay in office, whereas a statesman will protect the future, even at the expense of his own career, which most certainly applied to Taft, especially in his final speech where he warned about sending troops to Asia that would eventually become the Vietnam War, accurately predicting the inevitable failure of the intervention in Asia in not just failing to curb communism, but the cost of American lives. In 1957, a committee led by future President JFK would declare Taft as one of the 5 greatest senators in American history, known as the Famous Five, which also included Henry Clay, Robert La Follette, Daniel Webster, and Number 2. John C. Calhoun. Another member of the original Famous Five, Calhoun is a controversial figure for his defense of slavery as a moral good near the end of his career to defend the Southern way of life. Ironically, for most of Calhoun's career, he was a nationalist first and foremost, and even when compared to his contemporaries like Clay, Webster, or even President John Quincy Adams, Calhoun wouldn't adopt a sectionalist mindset until much later in his life. Calhoun is one of the most accomplished politicians in American history to never become president, holding nearly every major office from representative to senator to Secretary of War, Secretary of State, and most famously, Vice President. Calhoun throughout his career played a major role in modernizing the U.S. Army after his experience as Secretary of War, as well as initially supporting infrastructure projects, though he'd become disillusioned with them after the Adams administration. Likewise, while part of the Monroe administration, Calhoun established the Bureau of Indian Affairs, maintained Indian sovereignty, made over 40 treaties with various tribes, and opposed Andrew Jackson's invasion of Spanish Florida. Calhoun had consistently defended the idea of smaller government, even opposing Jackson's war on the Second National Bank, believing it to be an overreach of executive authority, and even aligning himself with the newly founded anti-Jacksonian Whig Party. He would eventually reconcile with the Democrats and play a major role through the Van Buren administration, and helped establish the independent treasury system, as well as fight against large businesses, believing them to be a threat to national liberty. As Secretary of State briefly under John Tyler and James K. Polk, and during his second term in the Senate, Calhoun would lay the foundations for the annexation of Texas while also opposing the Mexican-American War. He would also help settle the dispute of the Oregon Territory with Great Britain. When Calhoun died in 1850, He had the respect of both friend and foe. He became known as one of the great triumvirate of the Congress for his zealous oratory capabilities, along with his rivals Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. Both Clay and Webster, despite their ideological differences with Clay, spoke highly of him, with Webster calling Calhoun a senator of Rome when Rome survived, and Clay declaring him the brightest star of the house. Calhoun was firmly dedicated to the American experiment and did everything he could to maintain the vision of the founders, and is one of the most influential statesmen in U.S. history. Number 1. Henry Cabot Lodge. Part of the Lodge political dynasty, Henry Cabot Lodge would play a major role in Massachusetts and national politics during his nearly 40 years in Congress. He was a historian with 4 degrees from Harvard and an impressive catalog of published work, who had a great love for early American history and the Constitution, while also seeing the future of the U.S. on the world stage. Lodge was considered one of the greatest statesmen of his time and an excellent parliamentarian due to his ability to manage the Senate. He was the de facto Senate leader, while as chairman of both Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the Senate Republican Convention, greatly influencing U.S. policy. Both during his time in the House and in the Senate, Lodge would support African American rights, with several failed attempts to protect black voting rights and criminalize lynching. Lodge was also strongly for imperialism, supporting the war against Spain and eventually the annexation of both Puerto Rico and the Philippines. Lodge was also a proponent of the U.S. expanding global interests, specifically with Europe, but also recognizing the importance of maintaining his country's sovereignty, as he began to oppose the Treaty of Versailles and eventually opposing joining the League of Nations due to the failure of the League to remove Article 10, which would have made countries in the League obligated to get involved in any armed conflict that an ally would be involved in. His objections would later inspire the successor of the League of Nations, the United Nations. After World War I in 1922, he would be appointed alongside Oscar Underwood, Elihu Root, and Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes to negotiate the naval disarmament of the major world powers. The 3 major treaties signed were the 4-Power Treaty, the Washington Naval Treaty, and the 9-Power Treaty. Lodge was arguably the most brilliant man to ever serve the Senate, being someone who stood firm in his beliefs while also being willing to compromise. He always put his country first and foremost and understood what was necessary to see the U.S. finally blossom onto the world stage without entangling itself in needless world politics. For this, I believe Henry Cabot Lodge is the single greatest senator and one of the greatest statesmen in U.S. history. What do you guys think? Do you guys agree with my list? Who did I leave off? Leave a comment, like, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.